Erev Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Challah. We're up to Perek Gimel, Mishna Zayin. Today's Mishnah should be Nishmat Neria ben Svetlana Aranbayev and Eliyahu ben Bucha Israelov Menuchatam Began Eden. Amen. We learned in chapter 1, Mishnah 1, that the Challah obligation applies only to dough made from one of the 5 species of grain: wheat, barley, spelt, oats, and rye. We also learned in chapter 1, Mishnah 2, that only these 5 species can be used to bake matzah to fulfill the obligation to eat matzah on the first night of Pesach. But dough made from any other grain like rice is exempt from Challah and may not be used to fulfill the mitzvah of matzah. And the Mefarshim explain that it's based off the Gemara in Masechet Pesachim, page 35a. The Gemara there learns from a pasuk that the matzah obligation can be fulfilled only with matzah made from grain that has the ability to become chametz, because we call lechem oni. Now, only grain of the 5 species can become chametz. Other species of grain, however, do not become chametz when they ferment. They simply become spoiled, and therefore they cannot be used to fulfill the mitzvah of matzah. The Mishnah now will discuss the status of dough made from a mixture of one of these 5 grains and another species of grain with regards to both of these halachot. If a person made a dough from a mixture of wheat flour and rice flour, the halakha is as follows: If the flour of the wheat grain can be tasted in the dough, it is subject to challah. And similarly, a person can fulfill his obligation to eat matzah on Pesach with matzah made from it. And the Mefarshim explain, if the wheat flour can be tasted in the dough, one must separate challah from it, even if there is more rice flour in the dough than wheat flour, based on the Gemara Masechet Zevachim, page 78a. And in fact, the Mefarshim explain, challah must be separated even if the amount of wheat flour on its own is less than 5 riv'im, which was the minimum amount of flour needed to create a challah obligation, like we learned in chapter 2, Mishnah 6. Because the Mefarshim explain, as long as the wheat flour and rice flour together total at least 5 riv'im, and the flour of wheat can be tasted in the dough is subject to challah. Now, generally, we determine the halachic status of a mixture by the part that makes up the majority. In a case of our own, however, we're going to apply the principle of tam ki ikar. Flavor is the equivalent of substance, and it gives consideration. We are going to give consideration even to something that makes up a small part of the mixture if its flavor can be detected. And therefore, our Mishnah is teaching us, if the flavor of the wheat can be tasted in the dough, the entire dough is regarded as if it were made of wheat. And the discussion for this is brought down in Masechet Zvachim, page 78, Amud Aleph and Amud Bet. Right, 78a and b. And like we said, the Mishnah says, Yotzeh ba adam yitechovato b'Pesach, a person can fulfill his obligation to eat matzah on Pesach with matzah made from it. And Vashim explain, meaning, if matzah was made from this dough, it is suitable for the mitzvah, because just like we apply the principle of tam ki ikar, flavor is the equivalent of substance, to teach that dough made from rice and wheat flour is subject to challah when the wheat can be tasted, so too it teaches that such a dough can be used to fulfill the matzah obligation. And in fact, even the rice portion of the matzah counts towards the required minimum measure of a kazait of matzah, as the Rosh tells us in Masechet Chulin, chapter 7, halakha 31. The Mishnah continues, V'im en bah tam dagan, but if the flavor of the wheat grain cannot be tasted in the dough, and na chayevet bechalah, it is not subject to the challah obligation. Ve'en adam yitzeh bah hidei chovato b'Pesach, and a person cannot fulfill his obligation to eat matzah on Pesach with matzah made from it, because if the flavor of the wheat flour cannot be tasted, we follow the general rule that the minority ingredient is nullified in the majority in a mixture, batel berov. Therefore, the wheat, which is the minority agreement, it would be nullified in the mixture, and the dough would be viewed as if it were made entirely of rice, and therefore the entire dough would be exempt from challah, even if it contains 5 riv'im of wheat flour. The Mefarshim add, because it's only the minority ingredient and you can't taste it. And similarly, one cannot fulfill the mitzvah of matzah with this dough. And that is in Rabotai of Mishnah Zayin. Mishnah Chet now discusses a case in which a person mixes some dough from which challah has not been separated, tevel, into dough from which challah has already been separated. Hanotel seor me'isa shelo urma chalata, v'noten letoch isa shurma chalata. If someone takes a piece of sourdough from a dough whose challah has not yet been separated and mistakenly puts that sourdough into a dough whose challah has already been separated, therefore creating a mixture of dough of chulin and dough of tevel, which Mifashim explained just as a background, sourdough is made by leaving dough to ferment. It's added to regular dough in order to make it rise. So our Mishnah is discussing a person who placed a small piece of sourdough into a dough from which challah had already been separated, not realizing that challah had not yet been separated from the sourdough. And the Mishnah is discussing a common case, really. The Mifashim say the same law would apply to a case where dough, instead of sourdough that was tevel, was mixed into dough from which challah had already been separated. It picked sourdough because that was the common example. But again, the Mishnah says that he should do as follows, but just as a background, midoraita, under biblical law, the minority of tevel, sourdough, is nullified in the majority of non-tevel dough, but the rabbis prohibited even the smallest amount of tevel and a mixture of the likes of permissible and prohibited food, min bimino, right, when it's a kind in its own kind. The rabbis prohibited even the mi'ut. Now, sourdough, the Mifashim say, and regular dough considered to be one of a kind, min bimino, and when you have min heter and mino eno heter, even a miut will not work. So in order to permit the dough, we must separate challah for the sourdough and remove its teven status. But this is not so simple. Why? We cannot separate challah directly from the sourdough because the sourdough is thoroughly mixed with the chulin, the non-tevel dough, and it's not identifiable. Nor can we separate challah from the sourdough, for the sourdough, from the dough from which it came. Because the Gemara says in Masechet Menachot, page 31a, that the separation of challah from one dough for another is valid only if both doughs have the same level of obligation, meaning they're both either biblically obligated or both rabbinically obligated. But here, however, the sourdough, which midoraita is already nullified, is only rabbinic tevel, while the other dough, the original we took the sourdough from, that's biblical. So Mishnah now is going to discuss how to resolve this case. So Mishnah says, Im yesh lo parnasa me'makom acher, parnasa in this case the Rav says is kemach acher, if you have another batch of flour. Im yesh lo parnasa me'makom acher, if he has a batch of flour to bring from somewhere else, which together with the sourdough contains the minimum 5 riva'im measure of flour that is subject to challah, he needs that flour into dough and joins the two batches of dough together, meaning like this. The new dough is placed so that it touches the dough and sourdough mixture, connecting the two batches. So when the two batches are combined, they contain the 5 riva'im of flour. The new batch of dough on its own, however, has less than 5 riva'im of flour, so you're combining it with this sourdough. And the reason why the new batch of dough has to have less than 5 riva'im of flour is because of this. We explained midoraita, the sourdough is nullified. It's subject to challah only midrabanan on a rabbinic level. So, like we explained, when challah is separated for sourdough, it may be separated only from dough that is also rabbinically subject to challah. So, had the new dough contained 5 riva'im on its own, it would have been biblically obligated from the Torah. Therefore, what we do is we take a dough that contains less than the required amount, which is not subject to the obligation on its own at all. When the new dough is joined with the original dough, it will be subject to the challah obligation only because it's combined with the original dough. And since the original dough is subject to the obligation only midrabanan on a rabbinic level, because midoraita the sourdough is nullified, the obligation of the new dough is also rabbinic, since the level of its obligation, which is entirely a result of the combination, is rabbinic, because like we said, the original dough cannot be greater than that of the original dough. Oh, I'm sorry, like we said, yes, since the level of its obligation is, again, rabbinic because of its combination, yes. Now let's continue the Mishnah. We said, like we said, if he has a batch of flour to bring from somewhere else, which together with the sourdough contains the minimum 5 riva'im measure of flour that's subject to challah, he needs that flour into dough, joins the two batches of dough together, motzi lefi cheshbon, then he separates an amount of challah from the new dough in proportion to the amount of tevel in both doughs together, meaning he calculates the total amount of tevel in the two doughs and separates 1/24 of that amount, or 1/48 of if the dough is being baked for sale, like we learned in chapter 2, Mishnah 7. Now, since the challah is being separated only for the tevel, not the entire dough, it's sufficient to separate an amount equal to 1/24 of the tevel. Therefore, if only 1/3 of the dough is tevel, he has to only declare 1/24 of 1/3 of the entire dough as challah. And again, by doing so, he would exempt the sourdough and remove its tevel status, and the original dough will not be permitted in its entirety. V'im but if he does not have another batch of flour from which to make new dough, motzi challah achat ala kol, he must separate one full measure of challah, 1/24 from within the dough and sourdough mixture itself, for the entire mixture of dough and sourdough. Because in this case, where the challah is being separated from the mixture itself, the entire mixture is treated as tevel, and he would have to separate 1/24, an amount equal to 1/24 of the entire mixture, as opposed to the previous case when he had challah from flour from a different place, he would only separate 1/24 of whatever dough is considered tevel. So let's say it would be only a third, right? So he would separate 1/24 of the third. And that is the Nabutai of today's Mishna Yomi. Everybody should have a easy and meaningful fast as Yom Kippur. We should all be inscribed written and inscribed in the book of life. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen v'amen.